My name is Reid Callahan, and I was 28 years old the morning my parents sat me down at the kitchen table of the house I'd grown up in and told me that my grandfather had died, owing a significant amount of money, and that the debt was now, in some manner they were careful not to specify precisely, mine to deal with. My grandfather, Frank Callahan, had died 11 days earlier. I had been the one who found him, the one who called the ambulance, the one who sat in the hospital waiting room for 3 hours before a doctor came out and said what I already knew from the moment I'd walked into his kitchen and understood the particular quality of silence in a house where someone has stopped being alive. I had handled the funeral arrangements because my parents were distressed and I was capable, and that was how things had always worked in our family. I had called the relatives and written the obituary and stood at the reception afterward and accepted condolences from people who had known my grandfather in the decades before I was born. And I had done all of it while carrying my own grief quietly because there was too much else to carry. 11 days later, my parents sat me down and told me about the debt. My father, Dennis Callahan, Frank's son, said that Frank had taken out a personal loan several years back, a substantial one, and that the loan had been cosigned. He said the cosigner was me. I said that wasn't possible because I had never cosigned anything for my grandfather. My father said I had. He said I'd signed the papers when I was 23, during a period when I'd been helping Frank with some financial paperwork, and that I might not have fully understood what I was signing at the time. I sat at that kitchen table and I looked at my father and I felt the floor shift in the specific way it shifts when something you thought was solid turns out to have been assumption all along. I said I wanted to see the documents. My father said they'd been through Frank's papers and that was how they'd found out, and that the lender had already been in touch and that the remaining balance was $41,000. I asked again to see the documents. My mother, Jan, said this was a difficult time for everyone and that she hoped we could handle it as a family without making things harder than they already were. I said I would like to see the documents. My father slid a folder across the table. I opened it and I looked at the loan agreement and I looked at the signature on the cosigner line and I looked at it for a long time. Then I closed the folder and I said I needed some time to think, and I drove home and I called the one person I always called when things stopped making sense. My grandfather's accountant, a woman named Beverly Marsh, who had managed Frank's finances for 19 years and who answered her phone on the third ring and said, "Reid, I've been waiting for you to call. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories, where the quiet ones finally say get heard. This channel's for the people who answer cruelty with calm and shame with the truth. If that sounds like your life, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe, drop a comment, and stay with me, because this story starts with a debt I didn't know I owed and ends with a letter my grandfather wrote the week before he died. And what happened in between changed everything I thought I understood about the people closest to me. Before any of this, there was a workshop. Frank Callahan had operated a small custom furniture workshop in rural Pennsylvania for 37 years. Building pieces to order for clients who came from as far as 3 states away because there was a waiting list, and the waiting list was worth being on. He worked in walnut and cherry and white oak, and his pieces had the quality of things made by someone who understood that the object was going to outlast him and took that responsibility seriously. He built dining tables that families ate 3 generations of meals around. He built beds that people were born in and died in. He built bookshelves that held the accumulated reading of entire lives. He had taught me to work wood when I was 8 years old. Not the way you teach a child something to keep them occupied, but the way you teach someone something you actually want them to know, with patience and repetition and the clear expectation that I would get it right eventually if I kept paying attention. I learned to read grain. I learned to feel for the right tension in a joint before committing to a cut. I learned that a piece of furniture was a promise to whoever was going to live with it, and that promises deserved to be kept in the same spirit they were made. My grandfather was not a wealthy man. He had made a good living by the standards of a man who chose craft over scale, who had never hired more than 2 people at once, who had kept his overhead modest and his quality high and his reputation clean for nearly 4 decades. He owned the workshop outright and owned the house next to it, a practical two-story that he and my grandmother had bought in 1978 and that my grandmother had left to him when she died in 2009. He did not carry debt as a principal. He had bought his equipment with savings, expanded his operations when the savings justified it rather than when opportunity suggested it might, and maintained a clean relationship with his bank that his banker had once described to me with genuine appreciation as refreshingly uncomplicated. This is why, when my father told me Frank had taken out a $41,000 personal loan several years back, the information had a quality that was not quite right in the way that a piece of wood with hidden damage doesn't quite sound right when you tap it. The resonance was wrong. The thing my father was describing was not a thing Frank Callahan would have done, and the fact that it had been presented as simple and settled and already known, with a loan document produced from a folder as if the folder had been sitting ready, made the wrongness louder rather than quieter. I was 28 years old, I worked as a structural engineer, and I had spent 20 years learning from a man whose fundamental principle was that the structure had to be right before anything else could be right. The structure of what my father was telling me was not right. Beverly Marsh had managed Frank's accounting for 19 years, and she was the kind of accountant who understood that managing someone's finances meant understanding the person as completely as the numbers, because the numbers didn't make sense without the person, and the person didn't make sense without the numbers. She said she'd seen the probate filing that morning, because she monitored such things as a professional habit when clients passed, and that she had concerns about several items in the estate filing that didn't match her records. I asked about the loan. She said she had no record of any personal loan in Frank's financial history. Not in his tax returns, which she prepared and which would have reflected interest payments. Not in his statements, which she reviewed quarterly. Not in any document he had ever shared with her or discussed with her in 19 years of professional relationship. I asked if it was possible he'd taken out a loan without telling her. She was quiet for a moment. She said it was possible, but deeply inconsistent with Frank's financial habits and with the relationship they'd had, which included quarterly reviews where he shared everything. She said Frank had been almost compulsively transparent with her because he believed the accountant needed to know everything to do the job properly. She said she'd like to see the loan documents. I said I'd scan and send them. She said she'd also like to see the estate filing in full, if I could get it. I said I'd get it. Then she said, "Reid, I want to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." I said okay. She said, "Do you believe you signed those documents?" I sat with that question for a long time. Long enough that Beverly said my name once to check that I was still there. I said, "The signature looks like mine, but I don't remember signing anything like this, and I have a clear memory of the period when it was supposedly signed, and I don't understand how I wouldn't remember." Beverly said, "That's what I needed to know. I'll call you when I've looked at everything." She called me 2 days later. The probate filing my father had submitted listed Frank's estate as consisting of the house, the workshop building, the tools and equipment, a modest savings account, and a personal loan liability of $41,000 with my name as cosigner. It also listed my father Dennis as the sole heir, citing Frank's will. I asked Beverly if she'd seen Frank's will. She said she hadn't, and that Frank had never mentioned its contents to her, which was not unusual since clients didn't always discuss their estate planning with their accountant. I asked if she knew who Frank's attorney was. She said yes, a man named Arthur Greer, who had a small practice in the county seat and who had handled Frank's legal affairs for many years. I called Arthur Greer's office the same afternoon. His receptionist said Mr. Greer was available for a consultation and could see me Thursday. I said I'd be there. In the meantime, I went back to my apartment and I got out the folder my father had given me and I looked at the loan documents again. This time with the focused attention I applied to structural analysis at work, looking for the things that were off rather than the things that confirmed what I'd been told. The loan was dated 5 years ago. The lender was a company I didn't recognize, not a bank but a private lending company with a name that sounded legitimate enough to be forgettable. The interest rate was higher than a bank would charge, which was consistent with a private lender. but inconsistent with Frank's established banking relationship that Beverly had described as clean and uncomplicated. The loan purpose was listed as business capital improvements. I looked at what the workshop had looked like 5 years ago. I'd been there regularly. I couldn't identify any capital improvements from that period that would have required $41,000 of outside financing. I looked at my signature on the cosigner line. It looked like my signature. The proportion of the letters, the slight rightward lean, the way the R connected to the E, it looked like me. But looking like me and being from me were two different things, and the gap between those two things was exactly the width of a conversation I needed to have with Arthur Greer. Arthur Greer was 71 years old, with the deliberate manner of a man who had learned early in his career that patience was the most useful professional tool and had practiced it for 4 decades. He had a small office lined with filing cabinets that looked like they'd been there since the Carter administration, and a desk with actual paper on it, and a window that looked out at the parking lot of a hardware store. He shook my hand when I came in and said he was glad I'd called. I said I wasn't sure he'd know who I was. He said he knew exactly who I was. He said Frank had talked about me often and at length and with the specific pride of someone who has watched a person they love become the person they hoped they'd become. He said he'd been expecting to hear from me sooner or later after the files, I said. I wanted to ask about the will. Arthur said he'd been hoping I would. He opened a drawer and produced a file and set it on the desk between us. He said Frank had updated his will 14 months before he died. He said the previous version had left the estate equally between Dennis and Reid, with the workshop and its equipment going to Reid specifically given Reid's relationship to the craft and Dennis's lack of one. I said the previous version. Arthur said yes, and then he told me what the current version said. The current version, the one my father had cited in the probate filing, left the entire estate to Dennis. I asked when that version had been made. Arthur said 7 months before Frank died. I asked if Frank had come in to sign it himself. Arthur looked at me over the file for a moment. He said Frank had not come to his office to sign that version. He said the document had been mailed to him for signing and returned by mail with Frank's signature and a notarization from a notary he didn't recognize, which was unusual but not technically improper. He said he'd had concerns when he received it. He said Frank's instructions when updating the previous will had been specific and detailed, and had included long explanations of his reasoning for each provision, which was Frank's way, and the mailed version had arrived with no communication, no explanation, no note, just the signed pages. He said he'd called Frank to confirm. I asked what Frank had said. Arthur was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man weighing something he's been carrying for a while. He said Frank had confirmed the signature was his. He'd sounded tired and a little confused, which Arthur had attributed to his health declining in those months. He'd said he'd decided to simplify things. He'd said Dennis would handle everything appropriately. Arthur said he'd filed it because Frank had confirmed it and he'd had no legal basis not to. He said he'd thought about it every day since Frank died. He said he'd also noticed the loan on the estate filing and that he had some concerns about it that he'd been deciding how to raise. I told him about Beverly's concerns. He said he wasn't surprised. I asked him the question I'd been building towards since the kitchen table. I said, "Do you think my grandfather signed? That will change willingly and with full understanding." Arthur Greer looked out the window at the hardware store parking lot for a long moment. He said, "I think Frank Callahan was a man who was precise about the things that mattered to him, and the previous will was very precise, and the change came without any of his usual precision. And that tells me something. I don't know how to prove but believe," he said. "I also think you should look carefully at everything, and that if you find what I suspect you'll find, you should bring it back here and we'll figure out what to do with it." He handed me a copy of both versions of the will as I was leaving. I sat in the hardware store parking lot and read them both. The previous will gave me the workshop and split everything else equally with my father. The new one gave my father everything and left me a single sentence. "I leave to my grandson Reid Callahan my woodworking tools with the expectation that he will use them well. The tools, not the workshop they lived in, not the business they had built. Just the tools, with an expectation attached that sounded like something written about me by someone who knew me. but wrapped in a document that had arrived by mail without explanation and had stripped everything else away. My father called that evening, which told me Arthur had called him, which told me Arthur was watching what happened next. Dennis said he'd heard I'd been to see Arthur Greer and that he hoped I wasn't going to make this harder than it needed to be. I said I had questions about the estate that I needed answered. He said the estate was straightforward and that Arthur had the documents and that everything had been done properly. I said I wanted to understand the loan. He said the loan was a matter of record and that, as cosigned, I had a legal obligation that the family hoped to help me with, which was why they'd told me about it now, rather than letting me find out from the lender. I noted the word help. I noted that he hadn't specified what form the help would take or from whom. I said I wanted to see the original loan application. He said he'd look for it. I said I'd like to have it by the end of the week. He said he'd see what he could do. We hung up, and I sat with the conversation for a while, turning it over. My father had always communicated in a particular way when he was managing a situation rather than discussing it. There was a smoothness to his language when he was working towards something, a quality of words chosen for what they didn't say as much as what they did. I had grown up with that quality and had learned to hear it the way you learn to hear weather changing. What he'd said on the phone was smooth in that specific way. I called Beverly and told her about the 2 wills and the conversation with Arthur. She said, "Reid, I need you to come to my office tomorrow. I've been going through Frank's financial records in detail, and I've found something you need to see in person." Beverly Marsh's office was in the kind of building that professional services occupied in small cities, practical and without pretension, with a waiting room that had 2 chairs and a table with magazines nobody read. She came out herself when I arrived and brought me back to her desk, which had Frank's financial records spread across it in the organized way of someone who had been working through something methodically. She sat me down and she said, "I want to show you what 5 years of Frank's finances actually look like, and I want you to tell me if anything is missing." She walked me through his quarterly reviews, year by year. Income from the workshop, consistent and modest, and exactly what you'd expect from a craftsman who charged appropriately and had a steady clientele. Expenses, equally consistent, materials and utilities, and the 2 employees he'd kept on for a decade. Savings deposits, small and regular, the behavior of a man who lived within his means and put the remainder away without drama. Then she showed me what wasn't there. No loan proceeds arriving in any account. No interest payments leaving any account. No balance sheet adjustment reflecting a $41,000 liability. Nothing in 5 years of quarterly records that suggested the existence of the loan my father had produced from a folder. She said she'd also looked at the tax returns. No interest deduction for a personal loan, no reference to the loan in any tax document for any of the 5 years since it was supposedly originated. She said, "Reid, if Frank had taken out this loan, the money would have arrived somewhere, and the interest would have gone somewhere, and it would appear in these records in some form." "It doesn't appear anywhere," I said. "So either he took out the loan and the money went somewhere we can't see in these records." She said, "Or the loan documents are not what they appear to be." I said it very plainly. "The loan might be fraudulent." She said, "That's the conclusion these records point to, yes." I asked what that meant legally. She said she wasn't a lawyer, but she knew what it meant practically. If the loan was fraudulent, the signature on the cosigner line was forged, and if the signature was forged, I had no legal obligation under the loan, and the loan itself was potentially criminal fraud rather than a legitimate debt. She said she'd already called a forensic document examiner she'd used in professional capacity before, a woman named Dr. Claire Weston, and that Dr. Weston had agreed to examine both the loan documents and the revised will. She said she'd also, that morning, contacted the State Attorney General's Consumer Fraud Division on a preliminary basis to understand what reporting options existed, if the documents turned out to be what she suspected. I sat across from Beverly Marsh, and I thought about my grandfather in his workshop, the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, and the particular silence of a man working with full attention, and I felt a grief that was different from the one I'd been carrying since I found him. This one had an edge to it. I asked Beverly why she was doing all of this. It was beyond what an accountant owed a deceased client. She looked at me with the directness of a woman who said things plainly because she found the alternative wasteful. She said Frank Callahan had trusted her with his finances for 19 years and had been a man who deserved that trust to work both ways, and that whatever was happening in that estate filing was not something she was going to look away from. She said he'd also told her, 6 months before he died, that he was worried about some things, and that he was taking steps to address them, and that he'd said if anything happened, to make sure Reid knew the full picture. Make sure Reid knew the full picture. I said, what was he worried about? Beverly said he hadn't told her specifics. He just said he was taking care of it and that I should know the full picture when the time came. Taking care of it 6 months before he died. While, according to Arthur Greer, someone had been getting him to sign a revised will that eliminated everything he'd planned to leave me. Dr. Claire Weston's analysis took 3 weeks, and they were the longest 3 weeks as I had since the hospital waiting room after I found Frank. I went to work. I drew structural calculations and reviewed load specifications and went to site visits, and I did all of it adequately because adequately was what I could manage when most of my attention was somewhere else. My colleagues noticed I was distracted and were kind enough not to press on it. My father called twice during those 3 weeks. The first call was checking in, he said, just wanting to make sure I was doing all right, that grief was hard, and he was there if I needed anything. The smoothness was still in his voice. The second call mentioned the loan again, noting that the lender had sent a second notice and that the family was very willing to help, but that something needed to be worked out. I said I was looking into some things and would be in touch. He said he hoped I wasn't letting grief lead me into making this more complicated than it was. I said I was just making sure I understood what I was dealing with. We left it there. I also, during those 3 weeks, went to the workshop every few days. My father had padlocked it, which he had the legal right to do as the estate administrator, while the estate was in process. But the house next to it was still accessible because my father had not yet taken the key back, and I still had the one Frank had given me 15 years ago. I went to the house and I sat in the rooms where Frank had lived for 45 years, and I let the grief be what it was without trying to manage it or move through it on anyone else's schedule. I sat in his reading chair. I looked at the books on his shelves, which were the books of a man who read widely and carefully and kept the ones that had given him something. I made coffee in his kitchen in the morning the way I'd made coffee there 100 times before. And on the third visit, I found the letter. It was in the drawer of his desk in the small room off the kitchen that he'd used as a home office for 30 years. A room I knew, as well as any room I'd ever been in, because it was where he'd gone over workshop accounts, and where he'd read in the evenings, and where he'd taught me to play chess when I was 10. The drawer was the deep one on the left side of the desk, the one where he kept files. I'd gone to it looking for a tax document Beverly had asked about. The files were in their usual organized order, and at the very back of the drawer, behind the files, was an envelope. It had my name on it in his handwriting. Not Reid. Not my grandson. Just Reid, in the angular, precise handwriting of a man who had written his name on furniture orders for 17 years, and whose penmanship was a form of craftsmanship in itself. Stood in his office holding the envelope for a long time before I opened it. Then I sat down in his chair and I opened it. There were 4 handwritten pages inside, dated 8 days before he died, and I am going to tell you what was in them as completely as I can, because every word of it mattered and continues to matter. He began by saying he'd been trying to figure out how to have a conversation with me, that he didn't know how to start, and that he'd decided writing it was the right approach because he could take his time and say it right, which he might not be able to do in person, given how he'd been feeling. He said he was sorry. He wrote that word first, before context, before explanation. Sorry. He said he was sorry that his situation had become my problem, that he'd spent the last year trying to prevent it from becoming my problem, and that he wasn't sure he'd succeeded. Then he told me what had happened. 4 years ago, my father Dennis had come to him with a business proposal. Dennis wanted to expand a real estate venture he'd been developing and needed capital, and had come to Frank because banks had been unwilling. He had asked Frank to take out a personal loan, using the workshop as collateral, and to add Reid as a cosigner to strengthen the application. Frank had said no. He had said it clearly, and without negotiation. because he did not believe in the venture and did not want to put my name on debt for something I hadn't agreed to. Dennis had come back twice more. Frank had said no twice more. Then Dennis had stopped asking, and Frank had assumed it was resolved. 8 months later, Frank had received a statement from a lender he didn't recognize for a loan he hadn't taken out, in the amount of $41,000, with his name as primary borrower and my name as cosigner. He'd confronted Dennis. Dennis had told him the documents had been signed during a period when Frank had been unwell and might not remember clearly. He'd said the loan was legitimate and that Frank was going to make it worse for everyone, including Reid, if he made a fuss about it. Frank had been 81 years old, recently diagnosed with a cardiac condition that affected his clarity on bad days, and living alone in a rural area where his son was his most regular point of contact. He had been in the exact position that made his situation what it was, old and unwell, and trusting in ways that become inevitable when you've lived a long, honest life and haven't built the habit of suspicion. He said he'd hired Arthur Greer to look into the loan documents, which was why he'd updated his will at that time, because he'd wanted Arthur to see everything. He said Arthur had told him the documents showed signatures that might be questioned, but that proving fraud would require expert examination that Frank's health made difficult to pursue aggressively. He said he'd been trying to gather what he needed without tipping Dennis off that he was doing it, because he was afraid of what Dennis might do with the workshop and the house if he understood Frank was building a case. He said he had asked Beverly to make sure Reid knew the full picture if anything happened, because he trusted Beverly and didn't know how much time he had. He said he'd gotten a copy of the original loan application to a safe place, and that the application would show that the signatures had been added without his presence or knowledge, and that the copy was with a woman named Margaret Olson, who lived 2 miles down the road and had been his neighbor for 30 years and was entirely trustworthy. He said he was sorry that he was leaving me this instead of the clean inheritance he'd intended. He said the workshop was supposed to be mine, and he'd built it with that understanding for 37 years, and the idea that it had been taken from me before he could give it properly was the thing that had kept him up more nights than anything else in his final year. He said, "You learned from this workshop what I most needed you to learn. Not just how to build things, how to build them right, how to understand the structure before you commit to anything else. I hope you'll bring that to this situation, because it's the only way through it that ends right." He said he loved me. He said it without decoration, the way he said the things that mattered. And then he signed his name, the way he signed his furniture, cleanly, and with the slight flourish on the F that I had watched him make on pieces going out the door since I was 8 years old. I sat in his chair for a long time after I finished reading. Then I folded the letter back into the envelope, and I put it in my jacket pocket, and I drove to Beverly's office without calling ahead. She took one look at my face when I came in, and she closed the door and she said, "You found something." I handed her the letter. She read it at her desk without saying anything, and when she finished, she set it down and she said, "Margaret Olson. Do you know her?" I said I knew who she was. I'd seen her at Frank's house over the years. A woman in her 70s with a kitchen garden and strong opinions about local politics and a clear fondness for my grandfather that I'd understood was the fondness of long neighbors who had looked out for each other through decades of ordinary and extraordinary life. Beverly said, "I think we should go see Margaret Olson." I said I thought so too. We drove together, Beverly and I, the 40 minutes to the road where Frank's house sat, and the 2 miles further to Margaret's, and we knocked on her door on a Thursday afternoon, and she answered, and when she saw me, she said, "I wondered when you'd come," and she stepped back and let us in. Margaret Olson was 74. With the directness of someone who had made a long peace with saying what she meant, and she had known Frank Callahan for 32 years and had been his nearest neighbor through 2 winters that had taken down power lines, and a summer that had flooded the lower field, and the ordinary accumulation of seasons that turn strangers into people who matter to each other. She said Frank had come to her 6 months before he died with an envelope and had asked her to keep it for his grandson Reid, and to give it to Reid directly when the time came, not to anyone else and not through the mail, directly to Reid's hands. She'd kept it. She'd seen the obituary. She'd been watching for me to appear. She went to her bedroom and came back with an envelope larger than the one in my jacket, sealed and with my name on it in Frank's handwriting, and she handed it to me across her kitchen table. Inside was a copy of the original loan application. I am a structural engineer and not a forensic document expert. But I had been looking at Frank Callahan's handwriting for 20 years, and I had been looking at my own handwriting for 28 years, and I had the letter in my jacket pocket with both for comparison, and what I saw in the loan application told me clearly what Dr. Weston's analysis was going to confirm 3 weeks later. The signatures on the loan application were not Frank's and were not mine. They were competent forgeries in the way that things produced by someone who had access to original signatures over a period of time are competent forgeries, better than a stranger could manage, not as good as the people whose names they carried. I put everything back in the envelope. I thanked Margaret, who said Frank had been a good man and deserved better than what had been done to him, and that she was glad I was there to do something about it. I drove back to Beverly's office and we sat together, and I called Arthur Greer and I told him what we had. Arthur was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "Bring it all in tomorrow morning. I'll have someone else here who needs to hear this." The someone else was a county attorney named Paula Reeves who handled financial fraud cases and who listened to the full account, Beverly's financial analysis, Arthur's concerns about the will, Frank's letter, Margaret's copy of the loan application, all of it, with the focused attention of someone building something in her mind as the materials arrived. When we finished, she asked several questions, precise ones, about the timeline and the documents and who had access to Frank's signature during the relevant period. Then she said she'd like to refer the matter to a detective in the financial crimes unit and that the documents should be turned over as evidence. I asked what happened next. She said the process moved at the pace of investigations, which was slower than any of us would want, but that what we'd presented was a substantive basis for a case involving elder financial fraud, document forgery, and estate fraud, which together constitute serious criminal exposure for whoever had executed them. She said she'd also be reaching out to the probate court regarding the estate administration, given the concerns about the will's legitimacy. I asked about my father. She looked at me with the particular care that people use when they're about to say something that crosses a line the person asking already knows is there. She said, "Reid, the evidence as it stands points in a specific direction. The investigation will determine what the evidence actually establishes. I want you to understand both of those things." I said I understood. I drove home and I sat in my apartment with Frank's letter on the table in front of me and let myself feel the full size of what it meant. Not just the fraud, not just the forgery, not just the $41,000 I didn't owe. The year my grandfather had spent trying to protect me while he was sick and frightened, and alone in a house 2 miles from a neighbor who kept his secrets for him because he had nowhere else to turn. He'd been 81 years old with a cardiac condition, and he'd spent his last year gathering evidence and writing letters and depositing copies with trusted people, doing the work that I was supposed to be there to help with and hadn't known was necessary. That was the grief that sat deepest, not the money, not the workshop, the year he'd carried it alone. Dr. Weston's forensic analysis confirmed what Frank's letter had told me and what the original loan application showed. The signatures on the fraudulent loan document were not Frank's and were not mine. The analysis identified specific pen pressure inconsistencies and formation irregularities that distinguished them from known authentic samples of both signatures. The analysis also raised concerns about the revised will, specifically about the signature that had arrived by mail, finding pressure patterns inconsistent with Frank's known signature samples from the same period. The investigations moved at the pace Paula Reeves had warned me about, which is to say slowly and thoroughly, with requests for documents as I hadn't anticipated and interviews I wasn't present for, and periods of silence that lasted long enough that I had to remind myself that silence in an investigation meant work was being done rather than nothing was happening. My father hired an attorney early in the process. He did not call me after that, which I understood and which in its own ways was its own kind of communication. My mother called twice. The first call was asking me to consider the family and to think about whether I was sure I wanted to pursue this. I said I was sure. The second call was her crying, which I sat with for longer than was comfortable, because she was also a person who had been living next to something and might or might not have understood its full shape, and the crying felt real regardless of what she had or hadn't known. I didn't ask her what she knew. That wasn't mine to investigate. I left it to the people who had the authority to investigate it properly. The estate was placed under court supervision when the probate judge reviewed the concerns Arthur Greer raised formally, which meant my father's authority as administrator was suspended pending the investigation's conclusions. The workshop and the house were secured. The loan company was notified of the fraud investigation, and the collection activity stopped. The investigation concluded 14 months after Paula Reeves first heard the full account in Arthur's office. My father was charged with elder financial fraud, document forgery, and estate fraud. 3 counts, each carrying significant weight. His attorney negotiated through the process, and what emerged at the end of it was a guilty plea on the elder financial fraud and forgery charges, full restitution of all fraudulently obtained or redirected assets, and a sentence that included a period of incarceration that I will not specify because the specific length is not what matters to this story. What matters is this: the revised will was invalidated by the probate court on the basis of the forensic findings. Frank's previous will, the one Arthur had in his files, was admitted to probate as the valid expression of his wishes. The estate passed, as Frank had intended, the workshop and its contents to me. The remainder split between my father's share, which went into an account the court controlled given the circumstances, and mine. The fraudulent loan was determined to be invalid. I owed nothing on it and never had. I opened the workshop on the first Monday of the following April, which was the month Frank had always said was the right month to start new projects, because the wood had finished its winter contraction and was stable and ready. I didn't do anything dramatic about the opening. I unlocked the padlock my father had put on the door, which had been replaced by a new one after the court secured the property, and I went in and I turned on the lights and I stood in the middle of the space where my grandfather had worked for 37 years. The smell was exactly the same: sawdust and linseed oil, and the particular dry warmth of a space full of wood that has been worked and reworked by someone who understood it. His tools were on their hooks in the order he kept them, because I'd asked the court to ensure nothing was disturbed during the estate's administrative hold, and they had honored that request. I ran my hand along the surface of the workbench. He'd built the workbench himself in 1986, at the beginning of the workshop's 3rd year, when he'd understood it was going to be a permanent thing rather than an experiment. And he'd built it the way he built everything, to last beyond any reasonable expectation of its life. I thought about him carrying what he'd carried through his last year: the loan statement arriving, the confrontation with Dennis, the months of gathering evidence while trying not to alarm the person doing the damage, the letter written 8 days before he died, taking his time to say it right. He'd said, "You learned what I most needed you to learn, not just how to build things, how to build them right, how to understand the structure before you commit to anything else." I had understood the structure. Beverly had understood it with me, and Arthur and Margaret, who'd kept the envelope for 6 months because Frank had asked her to. The structure of what had happened had been visible, if you looked at it with the right attention. The loan that left no trace in any financial record. The will that arrived by mail without the precision that was Frank's signature on everything he cared about. The signature that looked like mine, but wasn't mine because it hadn't come from me. The structure had told the truth, even when the documents were trying to tell a lie. That was the lesson. Not just the lesson of this situation, but the lesson Frank had been teaching me since I was 8 years old at this workbench. The structure doesn't lie if you know how to read it. And if you know how to read it, you can find the damage before it becomes a failure. Beverly came to the workshop in May officially to close out the estate accounting and transfer the financial records to my management. Unofficially, to see the place she'd heard about for 19 years without ever visiting it. She walked around slowly, looking at the tools and the workbench and the pieces Frank had in various stages of completion that I'd been figuring out how to finish in the way he'd have finished them. She stopped in front of a dining table he'd been building for a client in the final months. nearly finished, waiting for its last sanding and its oil finish, and the hardware for the leaves. She ran her hand across the surface the way I'd run mine across the workbench. She said he was good at this. I said yes. She said he was good at the other things too. Knowing who to trust. Knowing what to put where so it would be found. I said yes to that too. She said the letter and the documents he'd gathered, the care he'd taken in the last year of his life to make sure the truth was accessible to me, that was its own kind of craft. The same principles. The same patience, the same understanding that the work had to be done right, even when the conditions were difficult. I said I thought he'd known. The end was close and had wanted to get the structure right before it arrived. She said he'd told her something once, years back, during one of the quarterly reviews. He'd said the thing about good furniture was that it held up under the weight it was built for, and that the test of whether you'd done it right was whether it was still standing when the weight arrived. She looked at the table, at the workshop, at me. She said she thought he'd built it right. I thought so too. Margaret Olson came to the workshop in June, which she said she'd been wanting to do for 30 years, and hadn't because it had always been Frank's place to invite her to, and now it was mine. I made coffee and we sat on the bench outside the workshop door in the early summer warmth. And we talked about Frank the way you talk about people who are gone, but not absent, with present tense slipping in between the past tense, the way it does when someone was substantial enough that they haven't fully left the space they occupied. She said he'd been worried about me in that last year, not about whether I'd figure it out, but about what it would cost me to figure it out. I asked what she meant. She said he'd told her once, sitting in her kitchen with coffee, he also let go cold because he also talked too much to drink it hot, that the hardest things about what Dennis had done wasn't the money or the workshop. It was that Reid was going to have to understand something about his father, that it was going to be a weight he'd carry the rest of his life, and Frank hadn't found a way to protect him from that. She said Frank had said, I can give him the workshop. I can't give him the thing he's going to lose when he finds out. I sat with that for a while. The morning light on the grass outside the workshop, the smell of early summer, the sound of whatever bird was working the field at the edge of the property. I said I thought Frank had given me more than the workshop, even so. Margaret looked at me. I said he'd given me the letter, the care he'd taken, the evidence gathered while he was sick. The trust in Beverly and Arthur and Margaret herself, all of it. The full picture he'd promised I'd have. I said what I'd lost when found out what my father was real. That was true. There was no way around it. But what Frank had given me and how he'd handled the year before he died was also real. And it was something I hadn't understood I was receiving until I was sitting in his workshop in April, with the lights on and his tools on their hooks, and the workbench he'd built in 1986, still exactly where he'd put it. He'd shown me how to carry a hard thing with precision and care and honesty and without letting the weight of it make you build badly. That was the inheritance. The workshop too. But that was the inheritance that mattered. Margaret nodded slowly. She said Frank would have liked hearing that. I said I thought he'd have said something dry about not getting sentimental over it. She laughed. A genuine laugh, the kind that comes from recognition. She said, yes, that's exactly what he'd have said. Here's what I carry from this story, because a story without something to carry from it is just noise. My grandfather spent the last year of his life protecting me from something he hadn't been able to prevent from starting. He did it with the tools available to him, an accountant he trusted, an attorney he'd worked with for years, a neighbor who was loyal, and a letter written when he understood his time was limited. He did it methodically and patiently, and without telling me, because telling me would have complicated what he was trying to do, and he was precise enough to understand that. He also understood, and I believe this, that the letter itself was something I needed. Not just the evidence in Margaret's envelope. The letter. His voice saying what he'd never been able to say directly. The apology for the situation. The account of what had happened. And the last thing he wanted me to know. You learned what I most needed you to learn. If you are in a family where something doesn't feel structurally right, where the documents don't match the person you knew, where the numbers don't balance against the history you have, trust that feeling. Get the financial records, talk to the accountant, find the attorney. Look for the people who knew the person long enough to know what was consistent with them and what wasn't. And if someone you love is old and unwell and has a family member with access and with appetite, pay attention. Check in not just on their health but on their financial situation, gently and consistently, and without making it feel like surveillance. Make sure they have at least one person outside the immediate family who knows their finances and would notice if something changed. Frank had Beverly. That made all the difference. Beverly noticed because she had 19 years of quarterly records to notice against. If he hadn't had Beverly, the loan would have stood. The will would have stood. The workshop would have gone, and the full picture would have stayed dark. The people who protect the people we love from the people who would take from them are often the quiet professional ones, the accountants and the attorneys and the neighbors who keep envelopes for months because they were asked to. Find those people for the people you love. Make sure they're in before they're needed, because by the time they're needed, it's often too late to find them. The structure has to be right before the weight arrives. Frank taught me that at a workbench when I was 8 years old, and he was still alive to teach me things. He was still teaching me when he was gone. I finished the dining table in September. The one Frank had been building when he died. The one Margaret had stood in front of and said he'd been good at this. I finished it the way he would have finished it, with the right grit progression and the time between coats that the wood actually needed rather than the time impatience suggested. And the hardware fitted precisely and the leaves moving, the way leaves are supposed to move on a well-built table, with just enough resistance to feel solid and just enough ease to feel right. The client came to collect it, a woman who had been on Frank's waiting list for 2 years, and who had known when she commissioned the table that it was going to be his last piece and had wanted it anyway, or perhaps because of that. She walked around it slowly and ran her hand across the surface and looked at the joints and at the way the grain matched across the leaves, and she said, "He really was the best there was." I said yes. She said, "This was finished by someone who learned from him." I said yes. She said, "It shows." She loaded it into her truck with her husband, and she drove it to the house where it was going to live. And I stood in the workshop doorway and watched them go, and I thought about the first piece I'd ever built in this space. At 14, under Frank's instruction, a small side table with one drawer that had taken me 3 weeks and had come out slightly imperfect in ways that Frank had catalogued honestly, and I had understood were not criticisms but directions. He'd kept that table. It was still in the house next door. I'd seen it when I went through the rooms in those early weeks at XB. I went and got it, and I put it in the workshop, in the corner, near the window where the morning light hit it, and I looked at it for a while. All the ways it was slightly wrong and all the ways it was trying to be right. That was where I started, at 14, in this workshop, learning to read the structure. This was where I was now. The bones were good. The work continued. Drop a comment below. Tell me your story, or tell me you're here. If this reminded you to check on someone you love, or to look more carefully at something that doesn't feel structurally right, do that today. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.